welcome Adele this evening to our webinar and to our Christians Aware community. And thank you so much for joining us. Adele is the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Sustainable Food Trust. I met people from the Trust about 3 or 4 years ago now, and it all began when I read an article in the Observer written by the director, Patrick Holden, who some of us know, and it was all about how we have to support and encourage small farms in the UK, but also around the world as well. And I'm very keen on that, so I immediately made contact. And we've had a link with you ever since then, which has been really good. I get things on my emails and keep in touch and write things and ask questions. It's very important that we do support small farms. Adele has been working with the Trust since 2013, and she is a geographer and a soil scientist, and she's an expert in something called the Global Farm Metric, but I will leave her to explain that to us all. I think it's quite new, but very important for our understanding and our work. I think today is a good day to welcome you. My diary tells me it is Apple Day in the British Isles. I don't know whether everyone knew that, but it's National Apple Day. So it's very appropriate that you're here. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Barbara. I did hear that actually this morning. If anyone else was awake at 5:45 listening to Farming Today this morning, they were talking about apples. So how appropriate. But thank you for having me here. I feel really honoured to be speaking to you all. And as Barbara mentioned, I think Patrick's done one of these sessions before, and he really enjoyed the discussion. So I was talking to him today about that, and yes, looking forward to hopefully some really rich questions at the end of the session. And I thought what I'd talk about today is something that we all engage with 3 times a day, perhaps more, and that is what we eat and what we perhaps should be eating to be part of the climate change, nature restoration, public health solution going forward. And it's something we all obviously have opinions on and feel very close to, and of course therefore it's to a degree up to you what you eat. But I think there's quite an interesting discussion now about which foods are part of the problem, which foods are part of the solution, and therefore how as individuals we can eat and sort of vote with our fork, so say, for the type of farms that we want to see in future. So I thought I'd just go through a few slides, if that's okay. And just before I start, I have to apologise. I live in London, and I have quite a lot of sirens and such like going past from time to time. So if there's any background noise, I apologise, but hopefully it won't be too disruptive. So yes, as I said, I'm going to talk about what we should be eating to be sustainable and healthy. And as Barbara mentioned, my name's Adele. I'm Deputy Chief Executive of the Sustainable Food Trust. And for those who don't know about the Sustainable Food Trust, we are a small UK-based charity run by Patrick Holden. We have been around for about 11 years now. And our mission is to accelerate the transition towards more sustainable food and farming systems. And so we work with companies, we work with farmers, we work with the government to try and understand how we can speed up the shift that needs to take place. And a big part of our work is thinking about sustainable diets and sustainable farming systems. So the first thing I wanted to say, is anyone a bit confused at the moment? This is a rhetorical question. But there's obviously a lot in the newspapers. less red meat helps ward off heart disease. Cheese and red meat are back on the menu after a study suggests eating twice as much as you should. Impossible burgers, these plant-based burgers that are starting to come about now. Lots of people are saying those sorts of plant-based products are part of the solution. Plant-based diet can fight climate change, says the UN. Eat less meat to save the planet from climate change. Climate plan, this is today's news, one day ago, last night's news. Climate plan urging plant-based diets deleted by the UK government as part of the net zero strategy. So, I mean, to sum up all these news stories, and this is really just a few snippets that I could find, but there's thousands of different news stories about what we should eat to be part of the solution. There's quite a big bandwagon that suggests we should be eating less meat, more plants. And I just want to kind of talk a little bit about that today, because I think it's something that is becoming a very hot topic for obvious reason. And it's something that we as individuals can all do to be part of the solution. So I want to talk about what we should eat, but I wanted to start from a slightly different viewpoint. I wanted to start from a slightly different place. I think, as we've just seen with those news articles, a lot of people think about the food products, meat, vegetables, eggs, fruit, thinking about food products and what we can do to be part of a change. I want to start with a slightly different question, actually, and think about what we should eat, but through the lens of what we can grow sustainably. And I want to take the UK as a case study, because obviously that is where most of us are. I know there's a few people in different parts of the world, which is great, but where most of us are, and look outside our windows every day, I want to take that as a case study for this conversation. So what can we grow?
Now, sorry to interrupt you. We can't see your slides, but I think that might be because I put you on spotlight. But do you mind trying to show your slides again?
Oh, so sorry. Yeah,
That might be my fault.
Sorry, there go my sirens. And now I just accidentally closed them. Here we are. Okay, I've got them back in. Okay. Right. So if you didn't see these were the news articles I was talking about, and what we should eat, but from the perspective of what we can grow sustainably in this country. So I wanted to actually ask you all, and please do feel free to shout out, is what is the UK's most productive crop? Yeah, just shout some answers.
Oilseed rape.
Okay, oilseed rape.
Wheat.
Wheat, okay. Any other thoughts?
Potatoes.
Milk.
Potatoes, milk, okay, interesting.
Apples.
Apples, yeah, appropriate.
Barley and oats.
Barley, oats, yeah, I sometimes get maize, but basically, yeah, you've outlined a lot of the things we produce in this country, which is interesting, but none of those things are right, actually. Our most productive crop is grass, and perhaps some people don't consider grass as a crop, but actually it's an incredibly important part of our food system as a country. So we're just under two-thirds grass as a country, and that's a mixture of permanent pasture and grass as part of rotations. So it's a really, really important part of our countryside, as you see when you look out the window when you're driving or outside your homes. And we often forget how important grass is as part of our food culture. So why is grassland so important? I'm sure a lot of you know this already, but grass plays an incredibly important role in locking carbon up in our soils. So also, as many of you know, I'm sure, most crops like wheat, like oilseed rape, like maize, like barley, most crops take nutrients from the soil. They draw up nutrients through their roots and they use it to grow. So that effectively they're over time depleting the soil of nutrients. And therefore, to be able to top those nutrients back up again, what used to be the case was we would introduce a rotation of a grass lay, as it's called, to rebuild that soil fertility naturally, so that in 3, 4, 5, 6 years time, you can start growing your crops again without the need for synthetic inputs. However, the green revolution has happened in the last 50 years, and now we have become very reliant on nitrogen fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides to be able to grow crops in quite an abundance, quite quickly, at quite a low cost. But this has come at the detriment of our soil health, because effectively those chemical inputs destroy the life in the soil. You can kind of, to a degree, understand why. The overuse of nitrogen fertilizer confuses the microbiota in the soil. It doesn't quite know what to do with it. And similarly, pesticides, herbicides are designed to kill things, and therefore it kills the life in the soil. So we've gone from a system where nutrients were built up naturally through rotations to largely monocultures that are reliant on synthetic inputs to be able to continue to grow crops at the speed and in the abundance we have at the moment. So why is grassland so important? If you think about the arable East, and I don't know if there's any of you who are based in sort of East Anglia way, it's very rare that you see grass anymore as part of a rotation. And we at the Sustainable Food Trust think that we need to be introducing rotations back into that landscape and rebuilding that soil fertility naturally. And of course, grass, and particularly when grass is planted with herbal layers like clover and other mixes like chicory, they fix nitrogen in the soil naturally. They encourage root growth. That encourages photosynthesis to happen in the plants. More carbon is drawn down from the atmosphere and locked up in that soil profile. And actually what a lot of people don't realize is that soil is the second biggest carbon bank on planet Earth. It's bigger than the atmosphere. It's only second to the ocean. So actually, you know, our crust of soil that circles the whole planet, and particularly the habitable land, is so important for us to maintain, both through permanent grassland and part of rotations. So grass is all very well, but it's grass. We as humans can't digest grass. So how do we grow nutritious food from having permanent grassland and grasslands in rotation so that farmers can make money effectively and grow food that we can eat? We graze ruminant livestock. So pigs and sheep are very, very effective graziers. You can also have obviously pork and poultry, but they don't quite play the same role. And cows have received a very, very bad reputation over the last few years for obvious reasons. Because this picture of a cow, which is actually a cow on another of our directors' farms in the Cotswolds, just outside Broadway. This picture of a cow is not necessarily the picture we often see when we think about feedlot animals in the US or China or other parts of the world. It's a very nice image here, but it's actually unfortunately not the reality of how meat is produced in the large majority of the world. But this is very much part of the solution in our eyes. So we believe it's really, really important to think about the animals which are part of the solution, i.e. grass-fed cattle, sheep, pastured pork and poultry, and then animals which are very much part of the problem, i.e. industrial livestock fed on grains from all sorts of areas in the world, causing huge impacts, including deforestation, etc. So I just want to dive into a little bit of the science about why that is, because often meat and cattle are grouped in one. That, you know, meat is described as one thing. We should eat less meat. Cows are part of the problem, when in fact actually there's a huge variation into, you know, the different sustainability of different types of meat produced in different ways, and also obviously the cattle as well. So we like to use a phrase, it's not the cow but the how, which is quite nice, I think. So just to dive into that a little bit more, why do we think grazing livestock are part of the solution? So we can't get away from the fact that all ruminant livestock effectively belch methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. And that's often what we hear about when we hear the argument against ruminant livestock. Ruminant livestock are part of the problem because they emit methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So it has a very significant global warming effect. We can't get away from the fact that cattle and sheep do that. And even when they're eating grass, they still do that, of course. There are different things you can do to reduce that. There's some really interesting science now about things like algae additives that can be given to cows, which reduce the amount of methane they emit, and a few other things as well. So there's some really interesting work going on, but you know, it's a fact of life. Ruminant livestock belch methane. However, they also play a really important role in bringing carbon back down to the atmosphere. And this goes back to my point about why grasslands are so important. They graze grasslands, which are obviously important for, in themselves, bringing carbon out of the atmosphere and locking it up in soil. But what happens when livestock like this actually eat grass is a really, really interesting thing. So if you imagine the Great Plains of America or Africa before, around the time that human civilization was starting to come to the fray, the soils of all those landscapes, pretty much all the landscapes around the world actually, at least prairie landscapes, were built through complex relationships between the grasslands and the livestock that used to roam there naturally and freely. So think about the big herds of bison that used to roam the Great Plains of America. They move around. They're in a massive big herd, but they move around. What they do is they bite the tops off the grass, and then they move to the next patch, and they bite the tops off of that grass, and they move to the next patch. And meanwhile, they're obviously pooing on the ground, weeing on the ground, trampling it all in, and then they're moving on. And what we've got very used to doing as a farming population is feeding cattle and sheep in fields, but keeping them in that same field for quite a long time so that they really graze that grass right down almost to the, sometimes you can see it's been overgrazed so much that you can see the soil at the bottom. And that's actually, it's not a very natural thing, because what happens when animals are in herds and they're moving more naturally is they bite the tops off the grass, poo, wee, trample, move on to the next thing. And what that does is it shocks the plant a little bit, and it thinks, oh, something's happening to me. Something's just bitten the top off the tips of my grass. I'm going to lay down more roots to protect myself. So it shoots a load of sugars effectively into the soil, which activates the microbes in the soil. And in turn, the microbes then feed the roots the nutrients that it needs, and it encourages the plant to grow more. So actually, by biting the tops off the soil, and it's a similar thing with strimming in your garden, by just taking the tops off, it actually encourages very prolific growth, and also prolific root growth as well, which in turn brings back carbon down from the atmosphere into the soil. So it's a very, very effective way of encouraging growth, which in turn helps with things like soil erosion in wet weather and windy weather, but it also encourages root growth, which brings carbon out of the atmosphere and into the soil. Now, what happens when you graze grass right down to the root bed, right down until it's been quite low grazed, is the same thing happens. The animals bite the top off, the plant thinks, something's happening to me, I ought to do something about it. And then an animal comes again, bites another bit off, bites another bit off, bites another bit off. And then eventually what happens is the plant thinks, no, I can't do this anymore. I need to hunker down. Something bad is happening, and it sheds its roots, basically. So it becomes this very, very shallow rootstock. And that means that there's less carbon being locked up in that soil profile. So it's a really interesting thing. Even within grazing livestock, there's a nuance between what type of grazing is right and what type of grazing is wrong. And how do we emulate those herds on farms? Because we don't have huge prairie landscapes anymore. We can use things like electric fencing to move animals on. So we can keep them in, if you have a sort of 10-acre field, let's say, you can split that field up into two-acre blocks using electric fencing and movable water troughs. And you can move the cattle on once a day or twice a day. And there's some farmers around the world starting to do this with incredible results, both for biodiversity and plant growth, but also soil carbon gains. So it's a really, really interesting kind of phenomenon that's starting to happen amongst farmers. And it's what we call regenerative grazing. It does, as the word suggests, regenerates the landscape, regenerates grass, regenerates our soil. And it's these sorts of arguments that we don't necessarily hear when we see things in the media, like eat less meat, eat more plants, even. We don't hear about these nuances which agriculture being part of the solution, mainly because it's quite complicated, to be honest. It's not something that you can easily put in a, a Daily Mail headline or in a 5-second soundbite on the radio. It's something that you do need to break down and you do need to explain a little bit. And I think sometimes we underestimate the intelligence of our population by thinking that they don't want those sorts of messages. And I understand that people want simple things, they want silver bullet answers, but unfortunately food and farming is not simple, and nor should it be kind of boiled down into these very simple messages, because if we get rid of all meat, effectively we will need to plough up our grasslands and grow more crops to be able to feed the population, which is what a lot of people are suggesting now. To be able to do that, we will have to rely almost entirely on synthetic chemical inputs, because we won't have these grasslands, we won't have these animals grazing in rotations which can build the soil fertility back up naturally. So yes, it's possible we could have a stockless world and we could just eat plants. But do we want to eat plants that have been grown either in water hydroponic systems with nutrients added in, or in effectively very degraded soils that are kept alive with synthetic inputs? I don't know. I mean, that's not the type of future that I see, and I'm not a die-hard organic person. I think there's a fine balance between what can be used and what can't be used, but I do think we need to be relying more on natural systems, perhaps the systems that many of you all used to see predominate across the whole country. And I don't really see this now. I largely see monocultures, and that's just in the UK, where you could argue that it's much less bad than in other parts of the world. But what does this actually mean in terms of us and what we should eat to eat from the sustainable landscape of our country? And I'm assuming here that a transition will start to take place away from the type of farming systems which are part of the problem, i.e. arable monocultures that are very reliant on chemical inputs, which in themselves have a very high carbon footprint, moving away from industrial livestock production, and predominantly in this country, that's pork and poultry. We don't, in the UK, produce beef and lamb very intensively in indoor units. There's some quite big dairy units, which we need to try and reduce those significantly and get those animals back outside. But we don't have the type of systems like in the US and in Asia, where there's these huge feedlots of industrial animals. So in the UK, it does mean a very significant reduction in intensive pork and poultry. And so that poultry and chicken should become a real treat, because I know that was the case. And now it's become a sort of cheap convenience that everyone eats, when in fact it's not really cheap at all when you think about the environmental and public health impacts that are being hidden behind that price tag in the supermarket. But what should we eat? I mean, we should eat with the seasons to start with. We're going for a seasonal change at the moment. And of course, in the UK, that means throughout the winter months, it can mean root vegetables, sweets, parsnips, potatoes, all really, really important and nutritional parts of our diet. Brassicas, obviously, we're really good at growing those. Broccoli, asparagus in the spring. Berries, we can grow berries really sustainably in this country with the right type of systems and through rebuilding our soils naturally throughout the rest of the year, so that the berries can grow in more natural systems. But we do have good climates, particularly down in the southwest, for growing berries. Of course, arable crops are still a really important part of our system, but what we need to move away from is those arable monocultures, back towards arable farming mixed in with livestock production where possible. So oats, that was also mentioned earlier, a really healthy and sustainable part of a diet. That means some bread, some nice sourdough bread, hopefully, for us all. Milk, I mean, grass-fed dairy, definitely part of the solution. So if you can look for organic milk, that's at the moment the easiest way to know that those animals have been grazed outside. But largely in the UK, most of our dairies are outdoor reared. Not all of them. There is some big ones out there, but if it's UK milk, you can be reasonably sure it's from a grass-based system. Animal fats is a really important one. Most people don't know that most of our animal fats, probably 99% of our animal fats, are burned around the back of abattoirs at the moment because they have no value. And yet actually the cooking characteristics of animal fats are very, very similar to the vegetable oils that we now rely on, like palm oil, which is obviously coming from the Indonesian rainforest and having all sorts of horrible impacts. And that's really what is in most processed food now. And I don't really advocate for eating very much processed food at all, but it does seem strange that if we're very good at growing sustainable grass-fed livestock in this country, why not use those animal fats? Why not live off the fat of our own land instead of the fat of the Indonesian rainforest or wherever it might be? So animal fats, I think, have been demonized, particularly probably by the sugar industry, for all these low-fat products that we eat now, which we think are healthy, but are actually full of all sorts of stuff. Cheese, obviously, lovely. We have some amazing artisan cheese producers in this country. I've been talking about ruminant red meat. I think it's, the message is about overall eating less meat, probably because we want to really reduce that pork and poultry, but making sure that if we reduce our proportion of meat down, we're really thinking about the type of meat that we're eating to be part of the solution and what quality that is. So as an overall kind of grams per week, it's probably slightly less than we eat now, but we argue that of that less meat, a higher percentage should be grass-fed beef and lamb, for the reasons I've been talking about, and pastured poultry as a treat. And I'm definitely not saying here that we shouldn't eat things like bananas, coffee, chocolate, such like, because of course we all like those sorts of things, and we do live in a globalized world, which is why it's really important from our perspective as a UK charity that has an international focus that we're working on these same issues all over the world. Because it's all very well if the UK transitions its farms to become more sustainable and our population starts eating in a more sustainable and healthy way. But ultimately, if we don't start doing that all over the world and trading products hopefully in a slightly more sustainable way, we'll be in trouble. So we're not suggesting we should stop eating things like this that we love, but we do think that we can get our core staples from the UK in a very sustainable way if we just think a little bit more about where that food's come from and the time of year. So sorry, this is a slide with quite a lot of text, but I thought I'll just briefly summarize this. And this effectively sums up our work as a charity. We think about what we can do to overcome barriers to change in terms of the transition to sustainable food systems. And we see there being three main barriers that we're working to overcome at the moment. The first of which is a kind of a market failure. The cost of food that we see in the supermarket, that sort of £3-4 chicken that's been intensively reared on grain from another side of the world, it's not really cheap when you think about the negative environmental and health impacts. And actually those costs need to be internalized back to source so that producing food in a way which has detrimental impact to the environment, public health, becomes the most expensive way to produce food. At the moment, it's the cheapest way to produce food because these costs are not being paid for. They're being paid by future generations who are going to have to effectively clean up after what we're doing right now with our food systems. So we see there being a failure in the economic system at the moment for valuing food and farming. The things we should be valuing, like our nature, our clean water, our clean air, are not currently valued, and therefore cheap food predominates when actually it's not cheap at all. Mixed messaging about what we should eat. I mean, this is really what I've been talking about today, so I won't dwell on this too much, but it is so confusing for people now. There's this upswell of, particularly young people who are communicating on social media and able to digest news very quickly. They're really confused about what to eat. And yet there's a huge demand, I think, to eat in a way which is part of the solution. And I think that's why more and more people are becoming vegetarian and vegan. It's really a protest vote against industrial agriculture, which, to be honest, I totally get. But actually, you don't need to go that far to be part of the solution. You can look a little more around you in terms of our landscape and what we can eat to be part of the solution. So we're really about telling that message in a slightly more nuanced way. And the third thing, which as Barbara mentioned is quite a big piece of my work, is the lack of a common framework for measuring the impact of farming. And that really feeds into point 1 here, in that the things we should be valuing are not valued. And that's because we don't have a common way of measuring those things or the impact on those things. And if you think a little bit about the financial accounting standards, there's a framework set, or a few very similar frameworks set around the world of standards that we all have to adhere to when we submit our tax return or our accounts for ourselves or our company each year. There's a common framework and there's a common language, which means it doesn't matter whether you're a one-man band running a small business at home or a huge multinational company. You can compare and contrast those accounts because they've been measured in the same way and they're using the same language. And so we think there needs to be effectively the same thing, but for measuring the sustainability on farms. So things like soil, water, air, animal welfare, community health, nutrient management, plant and crop health, the list goes on. But we are creating a framework of measures that we believe could become the standard for measuring impact all over the world. And that's called the Global Farm Metric. And it's a project we've been working on for about 5 years now. And really it was just an idea that was developed by farmers initially. And we asked them what they felt they should be measuring and reporting on in terms of the sustainability of their farms. And they came up with a list. Some feedback. They came up with a list of measures that we have since been taking forward to try and get agreement on. And we're now working with a coalition of 50 or so organisations as part of the Global Farm Metric Coalition. And that includes all the major retailers, DEFRA, the Welsh Government, Scottish Government, NatWest Bank, Lloyds Bank, WWF, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, RAP, the National Farmers Union, Country Landowners Association, all sorts of different organisations, all coming to the need for this common way of measuring impact on farms. And what we feel, and this is just to hopefully give you a little taster of, why won't my slide move on? There we are. This is the Global Farm Metric basically, and it looks a little bit complicated because this is effectively what the farmers would see in terms of the different things that they could be measuring on farm. And what we see is that these 11 categories here could be distilled into 3 categories. And much like the sugar, salt, fat traffic light system that you see on products in the supermarket now, the nutrition labeling, we see that there could be a similar system for sustainability effectively, and that these 11 categories could be distilled down into nature, climate, and health and well-being. And for any product you see in any shop, supermarket, box scheme, it will have that stamp on it effectively to show you what the impact of that system is. And why we feel it's really important to encompass all of these things and not just carbon is that carbon only tells one part of a story on a farm. And actually we need to be thinking about things like our nature, our biodiversity, our water quality, our worker well-being, our community well-being, our plant and crop health, our nutrient management. And so if you just think about solving one thing, like reducing greenhouse gases to mitigate against climate change, you end up with all sorts of unintended consequences. And farming it's a system, it's a cycle. It's a whole ecosystem of different things taking place. And therefore we need to measure that ecosystem in a very holistic way. And that's why we're suggesting that we should communicate nature, climate, and health and well-being to consumers, not just the climate impact, because that's really just one part of this story that we need to tell. So I think I'll stop there actually, because I really want to save some time for discussion and questions, because I think almost that's the most interesting thing when we talk about all this. But I hope I haven't confused you all, and if I have, I'm very sorry. But I look forward to hopefully answering some questions. So please fire away. And I haven't been able to look at the chat, so